In 1987, the UK saw the opening of the American Adventure, a theme park based around the Wild West and American culture, with cowboys, saloons, runaway mine trains, live bison, and all the makings of a very British view of the United States. A big step forward for the country in its transition from amusement parks to high-concept theme parks. One built to replace a previous park fraught with controversy, and a hopeful competitor to the giant that was Alton Towers. But while the American Adventure may have seen a promising first few years, it was unfortunately never able to reach the heights it aimed for, suffering a slow decline through the 90s and early 2000s, eventually closing and being left in a state of abandonment. Oh, and also the bison escaped. An unusual but very interesting attempt to build a modern theme park in the UK. So for the first time on this channel, I want to take a look at a park in my own country and uncover the history of Britain's abandoned Wild West theme park. In order to fully tell the story of the American Adventure, it's important to first know the story of its failed predecessor, Britannia Park. In 1970, the Derbyshire County Council in England's Midlands opened Shipley Country Park, the former site of the old Shipley Colliery, a coal mine that had closed in the mid-60s amid a rapidly declining industry. Pathways, wildlife areas, and picnic spots surrounding Shipley Lake, a quiet spot, a drastic change from the old mine. But the park still had an area by the lake the council had designated for further development. Perhaps they hoped a leisure centre, or a golf course, or maybe even a theme park. In 1979, the council would award a contract for the development of the land next to Shipley Lake to a company named KLF. The head of KLF, a man named Peter Kellard, had pitched his idea to construct Britannia Park, a new theme park entirely based around British culture and old-school British nostalgia. Unlike the in-your-face amusement parks with noisy roller coasters and flashy thrill rides, Kellard's project was to be slower and more focused on theming and educational exhibits, with its key attraction being the British Genius Pavilion, an indoor walkthrough educating guests about notable British inventions and achievements. KLF would be given a 90-year lease on the 350 acres of land surrounding the lake, as development began on one of Britain's first modern-style theme parks. That construction, however, would be delayed, as in 1981, local elections would see the council switch from Conservative to Labour control, and the council's new head, David Bookbinder, firmly opposed to the project, would seek to prevent it from happening. Struggles between KLF and the council would bring years of delays, eventually settled by a lawsuit, with Britannia Park resuming construction in 1984, and finally opening its doors to the public on the 27th of June 1985. For its grand opening, the park would be opened by famous boxer Henry Cooper. A large crowd did attend the opening, and impressively, the supersonic jet Concorde did low flyovers of Shipley Lake. But as Britannia Park opened, both supporters and critics would see the same thing. The place was completely unfinished. The park's map promised visitors areas like Small World, a collection of miniature recreations of famous landmarks from around the British Commonwealth, the Festival Village, where craftsmen would display traditional skills like blacksmithing and woodworking, and Adventureland, an area that did, after all, contain some thrill rides. But the miniatures weren't ready for opening. Neither was the supposed big draw, the British Genius attraction. And what would greet guests in 1985 was instead a barren patch of scrubland with a few uninspired brick buildings, a Royal Air Force plane for some reason, and just beyond the guest-accessible areas, a still very much active construction site, rushing to finish the rest of the job. Later in the summer, the park would manage to open much of what it had originally promised. A miniature railway was completed, and water skiing shows would begin on the lake. Eventually, the British Genius attraction would open, a collection of wax figures of famous Brits like Isaac Newton, Winston Churchill, and William Shakespeare. But the additions were too little too late, and when the summer season ended, Britannia Park would permanently close after only 2 months of operation. Some of the attractions, like the Festival Village, did remain open in a reduced state until November, but Britannia Park as a concept had clearly failed. However, the closure of the park would be the least of Peter Callott's worries, as its collapse left his company in over £9 million of debt to various creditors, many of which were small businesses who had been hired to work on construction and had still not been paid. Even Henry Cooper was still owed £10,000 for his appearance and a commercial he had made for the park. And soon after, it was alleged by KLF's former commercial manager that the company had knowingly misled its creditors about the state of its finances. A fraud investigation was launched by the police, and Peter Callott was put on trial. A trial which turned out to be, at the time, the longest criminal trial in British history, resulting in Callott's imprisonment for 4 years. A lot of the story about the collapse of Britannia Park specifically was first covered extensively by a TV documentary that was made as it was happening, which is what some of this footage comes from. And if you'd like to watch that, I'll link it in the description. In the aftermath of the collapse of Britannia Park, the Derbyshire Council would buy back the site in 1986 for £2.5 million, and later that year would lease Shipley Lake once again to another company, in the hopes of making a second attempt at opening the region's newest theme park. The new company that would come on board for attempt 2 at Shipley Lake was the Granada Group, a major media company, the owners of Granada Television, which later merged to form ITV. That year, Granada had already purchased the medieval Camelot theme park in Lancashire, and was planning to invest £7.5 million into the old Britannia Park site. While its predecessor had chosen to focus on smaller educational attractions, the last 7 years had brought a lot of change in the industry. With the growth of places like Alton Towers and Thorpe Park so far in the 80s, and with the declining Chessington Zoo soon to reopen as the newly imagined Chessington World of Adventures, Granada decided that they too wanted to build a more exciting ride-based theme park. And so their new park would bring more rides, attractions, stunt shows, and of course, a roller coaster. Granada would also do away with the Best of Britain theme, opting for a flashier, more well-defined look, themed to the old American West, a park that would be named the American Adventure. Work would begin that year to convert the existing Britannia Park buildings into attractions more fitting of the Wild West. But Granada would also massively expand their offerings, building on the other side of the lake as well. Construction would take about a year, and in July 1987, the American Adventure theme park would officially open. Guests would enter the American Adventure in the same place as Britannia Park, but the entrance building, originally named rather simply the Concourse, had been converted into New Orleans Square. Here would be typical guest services buildings, camera rentals, and gift shops, and also, much like Disneyland's New Orleans Square, a restaurant named the Blue Bayou. The original entrance building sat on a small hill slightly above the rest of the land, and as guests exited its courtyard area, the remainder of the park would reveal itself. American colonial buildings, a western town, covered wagons, a steam train, and a Wild West mountain in the distance, all surrounding the lake. Also near the entrance would be a style of attraction very popular in the 80s and 90s, a singing animatronic show. A show named The Good Old Bears, where a band of animatronic bears, very reminiscent to Disney's Country Bear Jamboree, would perform songs from within a glass display. Approaching the lake shore, guests would find more of Britannia Park's old buildings. The area once containing semi-finished buildings like the Lakeside Tea Rooms had now become the New England Village, containing additional gift shops, craft shops, and an arcade. The water itself had now become San Francisco Wharf, and from there guests could cross a land bridge onto Snake Island, a formerly empty island in Shipley Lake that now contained a small Native American village and an octopus flat ride. Nearby, they would be able to hop on board a new miniature train route, replacing the previous train from Britannia Park, now named the Santa Fe Railroad. Most of the rest of the park would be themed to the common cowboys and Indians trope, with areas being split between pioneer towns and Native American villages. The large building, once home to the underwhelming British Genius exhibit, had instead become Pioneer Playland, an indoor soft play place for kids, the RAF plane removed from outside, and the building's facade replaced with faux rockwork, and large, only slightly unsettling faces sticking out of it, reminiscent of a Native American Mount Rushmore. The building inside was 40,000 square feet, housing things like a sailing ship and a western fort. The play area was one of the park's most important additions, as it would allow for the American adventure to remain partially open over the winter, bringing money in during the off-season. Around the side, the building also housed a 200-seat theatre playing a movie about Native Americans. Nearby would be more of the park's simple flat rides, most notably a swinging pirate ship named the Yankee Clipper, and the High Sierra Wagon Train, a Ferris wheel with cars built to look like covered wagons. Boot Hill, a graveyard containing tombstones, would be used to commemorate the celebrities who visited the park, and beyond that would be Silver City, the cowboy town, an area with buildings containing more souvenir shops and places to buy snacks, and themed storefronts for photo opportunities like the county jail and the funeral parlor. The large open space in front of the storefronts would also serve as the stage for the Cowboy Show, where live performers would hold a shootout at high noon, or twice daily. After watching the show, guests could head into the town's saloon, another of the park's restaurants, hosting a musical dinner show. Silver City would also be one of 2 launching points for the paddle steamboats that could take guests across Shipley Lake. Venturing around the lake into a brand new area would be a large artificial mountain, named Thunder Mountain. Not Big Thunder Mountain, can't be too similar now, containing 2 of the American Adventure's biggest rides. The first, the UK's tallest log flume, named Cherokee Falls, and the second, the Thunder Canyon Runaway Train, a powered roller coaster, a runaway mine train winding through and around the mountain. Both rides were manufactured by nearby Big Country Motioneering, one of a very small number of British roller coaster manufacturers. A wilderness trading post would feature the second roller coaster in the park, a Zamperla powered coaster named Buffalo Stampede. Near the coaster, the park also brought in live bison. Early on in its lifespan, one of these bison even escaped from the park, eventually being trapped in a nearby pub. The last of the park's areas held a courtyard designed to look like the Texas Alamo, with a nearby petting zoo, and an old arena and grandstand in that area that had been built for Britannia Park was renamed the El Paso Arena, where stunt shows and horse riding shows would take place. Those were the key parts of the American Adventure theme park as it existed in its opening year. A very British view of the stereotypical American Wild West. The American Adventure was not technically the first theme park in the UK, depending on your exact definition. Thorpe Park and Alton Towers had begun to incorporate themed dark rides and themed areas since the early 80s. And, of course, Lancashire's Camelot Park was already operating too. But it did represent a major step forward for the now rapidly accelerating industry in the country. A site entirely based around a central theme, with a level of detail its competitors hadn't yet reached. And the park would sometimes promote itself as Britain's first totally themed park. In its first season, the American Adventure welcomed 400,000 visitors, still well below the likes of Alton Towers, but a successful enough opening year. And in the off-season, the park would look towards its first expansion. For 1988, £3.5 million would be spent on new attractions, with most of that money going towards a brand new area next to Thunder Mountain named Fort St. Lawrence, containing a wilderness fort, a balloon ride named the Mason-Dixon Flyer Balloon Race, sponsored by Virgin Airlines, and the biggest addition, a whitewater rapids ride named the Great Niagara Rapids, the new largest ride by footprint in the park, and one of the country's biggest rapids rides. 1988 would be another moderately successful season. But while the American Adventure seemed like it was happily cementing itself as Britain's Wild West park, other theme parks in the country would start to catch up to its level of theming. In 1989, Surrey's Thorpe Park would open the Canada Creek area, with a similar frontier look, and home to the new tallest log flume in the country, Loggers Leap. With the threat of increasing themed competition, the American Adventure would seek to expand its identity in 1989, deciding that it needed to move from a strictly American frontier park to one based around American culture in general. A shift in direction perhaps caused by the departure of the park's head, John Rigby, who was central in the original focused design. And so that season, guests could visit Spaceport USA, themed to American space exploration, and featuring another roller coaster named the Missile, a Vekoma Boomerang, officially opened in July of that year by none other than Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who received his own tombstone on Boot Hill. Spaceport USA would also open with a cinema named Screen 2001 and an indoor flat ride named G-Force, an off-the-shelf waltzer, but held in the dark, simulating a flight through space. The spaceport expansion meant that the American Adventure now wrapped all the way around Shipley Lake. The Santa Fe Railroad was extended with a new station, now completing a full circuit. The park would see continued steady growth into the early 90s. 1991 would bring the most popular season in the park's history, welcoming 620,000 guests. New flat rides were installed in the Alamo area, which had also seen its horse riding, now competing with a motorbike stunt show. And 2 years later, in 1993, the Granada Group would finally bring a response to Loggers Leap, as Cherokee Falls was upgraded to add a third drop, now 60 feet high, once again reclaiming the title of tallest log flume in the UK. To celebrate the dethroning, the ride was renamed Nightmare Niagara, and the Great Niagara Rapids were renamed the Rocky Mountain Rapids. However, the third drop no longer fit into the mountain itself, instead standing bare above the rest of the structure, a loss of some of the park's well-planned theming. The next year, Pioneer Playland was reduced in size to accommodate the new Motion Master Theatre, a 4D theatre initially playing a pre-existing film based on the Terminator movie, and later one based on the movie Aliens. To promote this, the Mount Rushmore faces were repainted to resemble futuristic soldiers. And also in 1994, the El Paso Arena was replaced with a go-kart track, named the Indy Karts, and elements of the horse riding were moved over to the Silver City Cowboy Shootout. In 1995, the children's puppet Sooty received his own Wild West show in the Pioneer Playland building. Legend, and a new double-looping roller coaster was brought in from Lightwater Valley Park in Yorkshire, initially named Iron Wolf, and themed not to anything American, but to the Granada-owned TV show Gladiators. Although I suppose that show was originally American, but it was a bit of a stretch. The opening of Iron Wolf showed that the park no longer really cared about either its original Wild West or its current general American themes, opening things that only kind of fit, but with a clear mismatch of different attractions dotted wherever they could squeeze in throughout the park. Whether or not the change in design philosophy had been the thing to do it, by the end of 1996, the park began to experience a downturn in attendance. Alton Towers, Chessington, and Thorpe Park had all received over 1 million visitors that year, and had been busy opening far more exciting roller coasters and dark rides. But while the American Adventure may have been an impressive feat for the 80s, it hadn't been able to grow its offerings fast enough to match changing expectations. Eventually, the Granada Group had had enough, and in 1997, they would sell the American Adventure to a company named Venture World. John Broome, who was responsible for initially turning Alton Towers into a theme park in 1980, was hired by Venture World to lead their reorganization of the American Adventure. The plan was to firmly ditch the American theme that had been haphazardly hung onto, focus on even more roller coasters and thrill rides, including a hoped-for wooden coaster, and rebrand as a more general amusement/theme park with a name change to Adventure World. For now, the park would be renamed American Adventure World, and a sky coaster would be brought in as an upcharge experience. The same style of attraction that was brought in when another park I've covered on this channel switched ownership, MGM Grand Adventures in Las Vegas. Most of the IP that Granada had brought into the park would of course be removed from the attractions, including at the Iron Wolf coaster, renamed to Sky Looper, and later Twin Looper. Sooty, however, would stay behind. Legend. And one of the other changes Venture World would make would be to the entrance. In order to keep the park entirely on the same level, the original entrance, used since the Britannia Park days, was closed, and a new temporary entrance was installed lower down near the go-karts. The panoramic view that once introduced guests to the park, now removed. The intention was that the original entrance building would be renovated and reopened sometime in the coming years. However, this never happened, and instead it simply sat blocked off. Despite the clear missteps the American Adventure was taking in the late 90s, that era of the park's history was still a genuine attempt at growing the destination. However, at the end of 1998, John Broome would leave Venture World, and his departure would mark the beginning of a terminal downward spiral for the UK's American theme park. In the new millennium, the American Adventure barely opened any new attractions, and instead, several of the flat rides throughout the park were closed to cut costs. Venture World was operating at a loss every year of the early 2000s, and unable to afford to build anything new, allowed the park to fall even further behind the other parks in the country it had originally sought to compete with. The only real addition during this time would be an area sponsored by JCB, a British manufacturer of construction equipment, allowing guests to have a go on one of several JCB diggers, for an additional fee of course, and only for 5 minutes. The Twin Looper roller coaster also received a JCB overlay, and at the same time, upkeep on the existing attractions would start to slip, effects on rides frequently breaking down or being left switched off, and paint being allowed to fade. The world branding was eventually abandoned, with John Broome no longer around to push it forward. In 2003, Venture World's annual losses would reach £1 million for the first time, and in 2005, the American Adventure would suddenly close a large number of its major attractions. The whole of Spaceport USA, including the Missile roller coaster, as well as Nightmare Niagara and the Rocky Mountain Rapids, were all closed and left blocked off from guests. Supposedly, this was done so the park could market itself more as a family-oriented attraction, but it's clear this was more just a desperate cost-cutting attempt. By the mid-2000s, the American Adventure no longer resembled the bold, major British theme park it had originally set out to be, but a much cheaper British amusement park. The next season, the Rocky Mountain Rapids would, surprisingly, reopen, and Nightmare Niagara would be torn down, and a smaller family mine train coaster would be built nearby. But it was too little too late, as 2006 would be its last season, and on January 4th, 2007, the American Adventure confirmed that it had permanently closed. Soon after the closure, many of the park's larger attractions were disassembled and sold to other parks around the UK, or some further around the world. The Junior Mine Train was sold to Flamingo Land in Yorkshire. Multiple attractions, including the Buffalo Stampede and the Santa Fe Railroad, were sold to Twin Lakes in Leicestershire. Missile was sent to Pleasurewood Hills in Suffolk. The original Runaway Mine Train was sold to a travelling funfair operator, and the twin looping coaster, once named Iron Wolf, was renamed Devil's Loop and moved to Poland. There are a lot more relocations too, like the Octopus ride, originally named Tennessee Tentacles, was sold to a park in Armenia. But the Rocky Mountain Rapids, which couldn't be disassembled, as well as most of the buildings and pathways that made up the bulk of the park's theming, was simply left behind. awaiting demolition or perhaps a potential reimagining into the third park at Shipley Lake. With Venture World bowing out, responsibility fell back to Derbyshire County Council to find new developers for the land. The following year, the council did say that they had 17 different applicants who were interested in redeveloping the site, but very little progress was made as the park became increasingly overgrown and the buildings deteriorated. While the council may have been insistent that something would happen at Shipley Lake soon, the situation on the ground made it obvious the park had been effectively abandoned. Urban explorers, as well as some vandals, began making their way into the park around this time, and pictures emerged online showing buildings left behind with their signage intact, but now deserted and unkempt. By 2008, some areas had been demolished, like the old cowboy town of Silver City and much of the Rocky Mountain Rapids, leaving behind only foundations and rough outlines of where the ride had been. By 2009, most of the park's remaining buildings had been torn down, including in the central New England area. But the Pioneer Playground, which in later years had been renamed Aztec Kingdom, still sat with its creepy fiberglass faces looming over the lake, an enticing sight for more urban explorers eager to see what was left. Venture World, whose primary purpose had been to operate the American Adventure, formally dissolved in 2011. Eventually, in 2012, 5 years after they reassumed control, the council announced they had greenlit a new project to build houses, offices, and leisure facilities on the site, now renamed to Shipley Lakeside. And in preparation for the new construction, the Pioneer Playground, the last standing building of the American Adventure, was demolished, the faces sitting atop piles of rubble. But still, this demolition was all that would change for the next 6 years, as Shipley Lakeside remained a derelict plot of pathways and empty foundations, marking where past attractions had stood. Finally, in 2018, work on Shipley Lakeside got underway, as the land was gradually transformed, with the first houses being complete around 2022, approximately where the staff parking had been. The lakeshore itself was mostly left as it had been, with the smaller of the two islands, named Medicine Man Island during the peak of the American Adventure, left empty. But land near Snake Island was reclaimed, connecting it to the mainland. Today, the area once home to the American Adventure theme park is a small housing estate. Construction has not yet finished, and much of the site is still awaiting further development, but many of the houses are now occupied. Last year, BBC News did a short report on their website, interviewing residents who now live there. Aside from the outline of the lake itself, any remnants of the American Adventure are now totally gone. All of the relocated coasters are still in operation at their respective parks. The Good Old Bears animatronics, which had been moved to the nearby Gulliver's Kingdom Park, had sat there deteriorating pretty much since their arrival. But in 2023, they were restored by an animatronics enthusiast, and as of recording, are still performing at their new home. There is, however, one remnant of the land's rich history, which still remains at Shipley Lake. Throughout the entire lifespan of both Britannia Park and the American Adventure, a brick building, the front gates, and the head frame of the old Shipley Colliery were left standing just outside the park. Those structures still exist today, outliving Britain's old Wild West theme park. The American Adventure started life as a promising new addition to the UK's theme park landscape. A really well thought out design with impressive theming for the time, and of course a massive improvement on the failed Britannia Park, but one that was just never able to keep up with its competition, very quickly losing its way, and through changing ownership and direction, became a much less focused experience, eventually ending up as just another cheap park. I wonder as well if some of the failure of the American Adventure had to do with its proximity to Alton Towers. The parks were only 22 miles apart. If you lived in nearby Derby or Nottingham, it wasn't that much of an ask to just drive a bit further to Alton Towers. And if you were coming from further afield, the much larger site that park had grown into by the late 80s was the clear winner anyway. Regardless of its eventual demise, and the many years towards the end of its operation it spent being not much of anything, I do think the American Adventure is still an important park in the history of British theme parks as a whole. As I touched on earlier, while it may not have technically been the country's first theme park, it was one of the first to show a large-scale commitment to this more modern park design. A place where the theming was an attraction itself, and you can see in the years following its opening how other parks took inspiration from it. Did you ever go to the American Adventure Park? What are your memories from it, and why do you think it failed? Let me know in the comments. Surprisingly, this video is actually the first time I've covered a park in my own country. Most of my audience is from America, and I tend to cover parks there more often than not, mainly because there's just a lot more of them to talk about. But there are still a lot of stories from the UK and other countries that, if there's an appetite for, I'd be keen to get more into. But whether you grew up going to this park, or it's completely new to you, I hope you enjoyed this video on the history of Britain's forgotten Wild West park. If you're interested in hearing more about forgotten themed entertainment from around the world, my most recent video on Patreon was about the incredibly short-lived and later abandoned Planète Magique indoor theme park in Paris. If you haven't heard already, I started a Patreon very recently to provide bonus content in between main channel videos, and if you're interested in checking that out, you can find the link to it in the description. Other than that, if you're new here, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are plenty more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.